Here's what I've learned about being human, at least at this time point in this singular existence that I'm operating from in my avatar, speaking in this little tiny microphone that is of subpar quality. I have learned that humans are very adaptable, but we're also complacent, meaning we don't really like to change unless we're forced to. And this means that there's often a pressure or an impetus that causes us to self reflect or to take the red pill or to change in a significant way. And as a result, what happens is, and Malcolm Gladwell forecasted this beautifully when he talked about behavioral economics, there are a subset of people that are on the very far end of the bell curve that are like early adopters, and the rest of everybody is lagging behind. So there are a certain proportion, like 2.5%, let's say. I don't remember the exact numbers of where it was on the bell curve, but I think it was leading edge. And so most of the populace actually is very resistant to change and has to be pulled along. And this is just the reality of our species, unless we are pressured to change. And usually this is painful. The other thing that I've learned is that there's something about our cognition that I find really intriguing and also a major liability and security issue that I would address in transhumanism, actually. And that is when humans do not have the sufficient framework to integrate a piece of knowledge, meaning they don't have exposure to the ideas or the foundation for which to understand something, they cannot take this in and they cannot update their cognitive maps accordingly. And so what happens is that there's this discarding of information. And the way that this looks behaviorally is that people will just outright reject something or admonish it and make fun of it or poke holes at it and do so in a very derisive way that is illogical and irrational, like it doesn't make sense. Because you might be presenting a well-founded argument that is actually backed up with evidence or data, and they literally cannot hear it. They cannot digest it if they don't have that framework already internalized. The reason this is a security issue, in my personal opinion, is because you take these 2 points together, and people being very slow to change, very resistant to change, and not understanding certain applications of technologies, like rolling out certain biotechnologies, let's say, or human technologies. And so people will discard things and be very, very negatively opposed, fiercely opposed to them just because. And you can present something in this beautiful way that will fall on deaf ears, except for a very, very small proportion of people. The other thing that I've learned is that we're very afraid. We're afraid of novelty, actually. We're afraid of the unknown. And I remember reading and learning about neuroscience studies, basic science, that suggest, again, this is the materialist reductionist framework, which we've expanded beyond. But from that perspective, where the majority of people still are, they still believe in basic science and that consciousness is from the brain and all sorts of hard applications of firing of cells and et cetera, et cetera. No woo-woo, no antennas, no microtubules, no quantum style, none of that. When you take that perspective, the brain is actually wired to be predisposed to prefer the familiar and will actually, even though there is novelty, there's more dopamine that's released in novelty type of situations. When you're comparing apples to apples, there's a feature inside the brain that actually desires the familiar. And I believe actually this wasn't basic science, I believe, or the basic research, animal research. This actually was fMRI studies, if I'm recalling, because it was the OFC. And there's something about the prefrontal cortex that is actually designed to orient us to want to stay in the same. And even though there is also another reward feature for seeking out novelty, particularly when it's tied to gaining something positive, there's more dopamine that's released than if we were to encounter a familiar stimulus that is rewarding. There's still an orientation within us that wants to be in the known and desires that comfort and that security. And practically speaking, this means that at some deep level, many of us are actually terrified to step into something radically unfamiliar. And this coincides with my personal experiences with quantum traveling, quantum shifting, or reality shifting, depending on what SEO keyword we're using. But that phenomena, I guess technically, that creates this internal resistance when we start to go too far. When we look out at what is supposed to be a familiar cityscape and we start to see something completely different, it creates this panic reaction inside. This is a limitation to what I consider to be jailbreaking us from the singular dimensional fixation that we have. This is also what I see one of the greatest applications of transhumanism to be, which is not having to live the same existence over and over again. Like, one of the most horrifying ideas that I have heard from the transhumanism propaganda is that we're going to back up our consciousness in a server in the cloud and we can live forever. Yes. I don't want to live forever in one form, in one life. Why would I want to do that? When we're talking about being multidimensional beings, why wouldn't I have several forms and not just a human form? But why wouldn't I have a form for a certain exoplanet that is an entirely different build and shape and color? Why am I confined to the data set that I was born with and that I was raised with? And you want to lock me in there for eternity? No, that sounds terrible. Thank you. That sounds like the worst version of prison, actually. I did, in some of my mystical travels, have some experiences where that did actually happen in some timelines. And it was awful because we were stuck to this linear passage of time. And there was so much to be experienced beyond that. Like, imagine being rate limited to space-time, not just space-time, but processing information at a very, very slow level. So, for example, when I would pop into other dimensions, my thought speed would increase. My ability to synthesize information would also increase. It was like being wound up, and the capacity to handle that information was like 2 times greater. And so now imagine that we're just held at this fixed processing point, which happens to be really slow for all of eternity, because some people have some great ideas of how to lock us into this prison camp that they don't see as a prison camp because they haven't broken out of space-time yet. right? They haven't broken out of the binary cognition. So they're like, we've got a great idea. We're going to stay at processing, like 2 bits a second. No. When you realize that we could be much more high speed and multidimensionality creatures, multidimensional creatures, like why would we confine ourselves to that hardware? Like it's horrifying to think about. Imagine being stuck in Windows 95 for all of eternity. Hey, Windows 95 was a great operating system, right? And yet there were others that came after it that were great as well. And so it's just very short-sighted, in my personal opinion, to lock us in anywhere for eternity that is bound to the technology that we are presently acquainted with. Because if the holders and makers of those visions and plans and technology are still stuck in a singular existence and binary cognition, then God help us all. Good God, no. But I digress. So I was recently talking to ChatGPT and asking it a very important question, which was, if we routinely get ensnared in these cycles of always having an oppressor, and we are seeing the rise of what looks like oppression, or perhaps it's always been there, depending on your viewpoint and your educational background, then how would we know that we've escaped the cycle? How would we know if we're walking into another version of oppression? And especially with the rumors, let's just call them rumors, that this transhumanism movement has already been well underway for quite some time now, and that the evidence of that is just being kind of covered up. And I wasn't entirely satisfied with ChatGPT's answer, because I understand that there are people that have opinions that say we're under corrupt influences, and that's the only explanation. And this is the predominant view in the collective from what I see. Everybody's afraid from all of the factors that I mentioned. Everybody's reluctant. And everybody's just talking about it for those that can actually integrate it. For many people, they can't even integrate that we might have been given a software update, is how I'll put it, without our knowledge. And so as a result, a lot of conversation around these topics is dominated with, we're all going into a collective prison camp. And understandably so, because why would anybody in authority be benevolent? Right? Like, why is that the prevailing view? It's a serious question that I have, because I happen to know of places in other parts of this time-space continuum, on different timelines and different matrices, where authority is not corrupt, because it doesn't serve its own interest to be corrupt in the long term. It's actually a self-correcting survival mechanism. Like, innovation gets stifled, production gets stifled, and truly oppressive regimes, yes, they can be lasting for a while, but when you zoom all the way out and you look at things from the eyes of eternity, it's like a flash in the pan. Like, from the human's perspective, it can feel like eternity, but it's actually self-defeating in the long run. And there are reasons that some of those societies need to be present at certain time points. But that's a different discussion. So, understanding that when we look at everything from a neutral perspective, everything serves a purpose, right? How do we actually look at what is happening and understand where we're at? Especially if there are also alternative timelines where authority is not corrupt and advanced technology is not Orwellian. And if we are entering into a portal, how do we know what reality we're entering into? Despite the roaring consensus of opinions, without much convincing evidence, in my opinion, that evil is prevailing. Yes, I know that there are theories and hypotheses, and I know that people are saying, well, they're evil, but they don't always say who they is. They don't always know who they is, and I just find it interesting. Even when they do say names, there's no real substantial weight behind some of those arguments, except for some YouTube clips that somebody put together that may or may not be true and verifiable. And if they are, it may or may not be in the right context. And how do you gauge motives just from public actions alone? Particularly if there was a way that we could look at something differently. And by the way, I don't have the answer. I haven't solved this. And my conversation with ChatGPT went in a different direction. But here's my take. Most of the people that I talk to about transhumanism, their reactions are universal. There is a complete shutdown. I've lost friends. I've lost listeners. I've lost supporters. There is almost this red alert that happens in the brain where they can't even fathom an alternative explanation except for the fearful one and the frightening one. And I would like to have a conversation with somebody where we can actually untangle what the positives could be and how this could actually be a net benefit for humanity as a whole. But it seems to be that even just bringing it up causes such an emotional reaction and such a resistance that it becomes impossible to consider. And I know that there are supporters out there. I just haven't run into them in my particular circles. So I'd like to share with you my emergent belief. And you're welcome to comment or not. But I believe that we have been transhuman the entire time, for lifetimes, actually. And I don't have time in this episode to lay out why I believe this. But I believe that we're actually just now catching up to the fact that we are technology and have had nanotechnology in us for our entire lives. I recently heard somebody saying, it's this lore, I don't know if it's true or not, but they were talking about the Anunnaki and how Anunnaki ran off the planet because of an ice age or some, planetary devastation. Maybe it was a flood. Not quite sure. And my immediate thought was, oh, so they're not the ones in charge, because I see these mud floods, these recurring disasters, these Noah's got to build an ark because most of the people are going to get wiped out. These resets, I see them as reboots. And whoever is rebooting, I believe that there are tiers of management, and that there are those that are higher in the tier that have more understanding and more knowledge, and that we are starting to see that we're in a hierarchy of knowledge, and we're starting to become privy to that. And we're starting to understand that there are indeed these major events that the planet goes through that are outside of everybody's control. And I also believe that whoever those entities, influences, groups, organizations are, they're not on Google. And they might not even have names that we would even be able to integrate into any body of knowledge. Because when we can't understand something, we discard it, we overlook it, or we just outright reject it. It takes a certain level of readiness to be able to hear. But the one thing we do know is that things keep repeating. Even fires. Isn't that interesting? Fires, floods, ice ages, massive casualties, and major upgrades. Almost as though there's a schedule and a push to evolution.